So there's a lot of buzz about net neutrality going around the internet right now, and as a consumer, changes to the regulations certainly are intimidating. But as an entrepreneur and somebody interested in Internet of Things technologies, what does net neutrality actually mean to us? Ultimately, what net neutrality relates to is that Title II of the Communications Act of 1934. In 2015, the FCC actually put something called the Open Internet Order in place, which basically classified internet service providers as having some need to be regulated under that 1934 Act. And in limited ways, it introduced some regulations that applied to the internet. Up until 2015, ISPs had voluntarily maintained net neutrality, and the only thing that the Open Internet Order did was to put the FCC in charge of regulation. So would repealing that 2015 Act be a positive or a negative? Well, in some ways it would put us back to the voluntary participation in net neutrality, which I think is something that says the market would decide whether or not compliance with a net neutrality idea is appropriate. As an entrepreneur, one of the things that I think is less regulation would open up opportunities for new services, new businesses, new technologies. From an IoT perspective, one of the questions that I have is ultimately, will vendors or providers of new IoT networks also fall under the regulations designed for ISPs, which would then ultimately restrict us from using architectures or business models that differentiate based on IoT traffic in a network? I think that is a risky area, because particularly in IoT, where you have the need to respond to different real-world events at different tempos with different responses, I think something like being able to differentiate based on network traffic could really be the difference between addressing an emergency situation versus tracking something that's routine like weather data. And ultimately, having some freedom to explore that architecturally and as a business, I think makes a lot of sense. And ultimately what scares me a little bit is taking these new, undiscovered and unfulfilled technologies and then applying something that was decided by regulators in 1934. I think that whole idea of applying those antiquated ideas mapped onto this new technology is risky at best. And ultimately, the other thing that could be impacted is a lot of our IoT designs require internet as backhaul. So what would it do to have the ability to differentiate between those backhaul streams? Ultimately, we'd be competing in terms of velocity and volume with things like video distribution from something like Netflix. Does IoT add up to something that requires so much bandwidth that it would require something differential in the internet service provider's zone? Perhaps, but ultimately I think it's the idea that some of these data streams are more important than others from a real-world perspective. So do I feel okay that an ISP might fast-track an emergency response based on an IoT data stream over somebody's Netflix feed? I think in that case, most of the public would agree, yes, that's an area where it's okay for the ISP not to be a fat dumb pipe. Does it mean we should allow them to censor our content? No, I don't think it does. But at the end of the day, I think the market would regulate itself without the need for regulations that I think are going to move slower than this technology will develop.